As you all know, well, most of you, I'm Professor Lance Long, and I'm filling in today for Professor Gardner, who would normally be here, but we are excusing him because he is actually, literally, I'm not kidding, he's at a high-level meeting in Washington, D.C., giving testimony and information about the WOTUS rule, the Waters of the United States rule, even as we speak. So he was unable to be here, but we'd like to welcome everyone to the Foreman Biodiversity Lecture. As you all know, this is sponsored by the generosity of Bonnie Foreman, who is one of the law school's truly great friends. And we are so excited for this event for two reasons. The first of course, we have Tonya Long here, who is a wildlife biologist and specialized in sea turtles. I'll talk about her in a little bit, and we all love sea turtles. But this is also the inaugural Zero Waste event. I'd like to invite up Brianne and Alex. I don't know if you know Alex Avera and Brianne Whitted, but they are the co-chairs of the Go Green Committee this year, and they had the wonderful idea of making this event a model event for future events here at school, in that this is a zero waste event. So what is a zero waste event? Just let us know exactly what that is here.
So essentially, the dishes that you're eating on, they'll all be rinsed. So that way, we don't have the additional plates, plastic forks and knives. And then your cups that you're using are recyclable, and so are all of the containers that the food has come in. And then after the event, any scraps that are left, we will be composting.
Yeah, isn't that awesome? So everything here is either going to be reused, recycled, or composted. So please leave everything on the tables afterwards. Eat all the food you can, leave as little as possible. But members of Go Green Committee and the Environmental Law Society will scrape the plates off, put them back on a cart. We will put it all into a compost bag. And I have arranged with a woman named Elise Pickett at the Urban Harvest, which is a local urban and gardening and education center, and they do composting there. They've agreed to take all our compost, which is why this is a vegetarian lunch, because we can't compost meat where they are doing the composting. And if you want to look them up, it's a wonderful program. They're www.theurbanharvest.com. So we'd like to thank them, even though they're not here, for helping us make this a zero waste event. Thank you, Brianne and Alex. Okay, now, Tonya Long is a wildlife biologist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And she received her both her bachelor's and master's from the University of Central Florida. And she has worked with the Fish and Wildlife Commission for quite a while, actually. How long has it been, Tonya? 5 years, primarily doing sea turtle work. As you will hear, what she's working on right now is light management and the importance of light, mostly the absence thereof, in assuring vibrant sea turtle hatchings. And she actually has done other things and has worked with beach terrain and the effect that that has on sea turtles. She's first and foremost, like many of us, a lover of sea turtles, but also has done work with other marine mammals, stranding response for marine mammals, estuarine monitoring and restoration, and environmental education. So we're really privileged to have Tonya. She came all the way from the east coast of Florida to come and speak to us today, so let's give her a big hand and welcome her. Thank you, Tonya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you guys. This is a very different venue and a different group of people than I normally get to talk to. And it's an issue that I think is really important and gets overlooked a lot in these sorts of environments. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about light management issues and how we sort of deal with them on a multi-level scale. So If you're not familiar with sea turtles, we have 5 species that nest here in Florida. We have 3 that nest primarily, which are the loggerhead, the green turtle, and the leatherback. Those are our most common. We also get some Kemp's Ridley nests and a few hawksbill nests, but generally just a handful of those every year. Just to give you an idea of what goes on during the nesting season for most of the state starts on May 1st and it goes through the end of October. However, if you live in Brevard through Broward County over on the central to southeast coast, the nesting season over there starts in March, and that's because that's the hot spot for leatherback nesting in Florida, and they nest a little bit earlier in the season than the other species. So all of the good stuff happens at night, which is why we're here talking about lighting today in the first place. So females come up to lay their eggs at night, and the hatchlings emerge from their nests and head to the water at night. All of the good stuff happens at night. So depending on what species we're talking about here, females will generally lay anywhere between about 70 to 80 to anywhere up to 130 eggs in every nest. And it'll take them somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 months for those nests to hatch. And that, again, depends on the species, and it depends on what time of the year those nests get laid, how early or late in the season. So females don't nest every year, but they generally come back every 2 to 3 years, and they'll lay several nests every season, usually at least 3 to 4, sometimes up to 7 or 8. So they're laying multiple nests with around 100 eggs each time they come back to nest. And what's really interesting about sea turtles is they will come back to their natal beaches when it's time for them to lay their nests. And this is one of those fun facts that a lot of people know about sea turtles, and sometimes they have an idea that a sea turtle will come back to a very specific beach to lay their nest every time, and sometimes that's true, but typically their sort of area that they call their home area is a little bit wider than that. But in general, if a turtle nests on the East Coast, she'll come back to the East Coast. If she was hatched on the West Coast, she'll come back to the West Coast, and so on. So this is just to give you a general idea of what our nesting looks like in Florida. And basically what you can see is that most of the state is covered by some level of nesting. So areas that are red are very high density areas. Orange is medium density and yellow is low density. But the big point here is that pretty much everywhere in Florida where there is a sandy beach is potentially nesting habitat. And you can see really the only area where we don't have any nesting is in the Big Bend region, and that's because there really is no sandy beach there. If you've ever been to that area, it's very marshy and it's not really conducive to laying your eggs in the sand. What a lot of people don't realize about Florida is that we are not just an important nesting beach for our states or for our region, but we're a globally important nesting beach. So here in Florida, we typically receive about 40% of the loggerhead nesting worldwide, and we are part of the largest nesting aggregation in the world. As far as green turtles go, we're a little bit lower on the scale, but we still are the second most dense nesting area for green turtles in the Western Hemisphere. So again, in terms of number of nests globally, we are very, very important. And that means that if our populations start having issues, that has major implications for worldwide populations. So obviously all of those areas where turtles are coming to nest are also the areas where people like to live. The coastline is obviously a very desirable place to live, and so that's where most of our population resides. And as you can see from the nighttime photo, that's where we tend to have the most issues with lighting. Wherever there are people and wherever there's development, we have to have lighting. It's a necessity, and it's actually the law. You have to meet certain codes for certain things with regard to lighting. So with the exception of Orlando and Central Florida, lighting tends to be the biggest problem for us along the coastlines. So this has some implications for both the hatchlings and the nesting females. Nesting females tend to prefer dark beaches when they are selecting a nest site, and they will actually scan the shoreline before they come up out of the water to sort of check it out before they decide if they're going to come up and nest or not. And if they are looking back to the coastline and they see areas that are very brightly lit, there's a good chance that they're not going to nest there, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but these females may end up going going someplace where the physical characteristics of the beach are not as conducive to incubating a nest as that brightly lit beach was. Maybe it's very narrow, maybe it's very wet. There could be a lot of factors about a darker site that make it less conducive for proper incubation. Now, if the female does decide she's going to come up and nest, having all of that artificial lighting interrupts her sort of navigation abilities. It makes her have a hard time navigating when she's on the beach. And so this is when we end up with nesting females doing all sorts of strange things. They may wander up and down the beach, as you can see in that photo. Let's see, is that a pointer, maybe? Oh, well. Anyway, the photo on the right, that was a female that crawled for about a quarter of a mile down the beach before she finally made it back into the water. This is also when we end up with turtles in places like pools and back porches and in the middle of the road. And fortunately for this turtle, she was seen before she was run over, but unfortunately that's not usually the case. Now with hatchlings, they tend to get sort of the most attention in this whole lighting conversation, and that's because they tend to be impacted more so than the females do. And that's because when they emerge from their nests, visual cues are their primary means of locating the water. And they're looking for sort of various sets of lighting cues. The first thing is that they're going to look for the brightest open horizon, and they're going to move away from a tall, dark silhouette. And so if you think about what a natural beach would look like with no condos and no houses, you would have a nice dark dune with lots of vegetation, and then you would have the water sort of shimmering on the other side. And so that open horizon is going to be out toward the water. But what's interesting is that sea turtles can also distinguish colors. And so when they are looking for these differences in light, they're going to be very attracted to short wavelengths of light. And if you think back to like learning the color spectrum, the short wavelengths of light are the purple, blue, green end of the color spectrum. So those wavelengths of light are very, very attractive for sea turtles. When you go to the other end of the spectrum, the long wavelength end of the spectrum, when you get into the oranges and the reds and the ambers, they can see those colors, which is a misconception. A lot of people think that they can't see red or they can't see orange. They can see it. They just sort of tend to ignore it for the most part. And so unfortunately, when we get these really highly developed beaches with lots of artificial light, those cues interfere with the natural celestial lighting cues, and that's when we end up with what we call disorientation. So disorientation is basically when hatchlings emerge out of their nest and they go places other than toward the water. Sometimes they'll wander around in circles, sometimes they'll go straight for the dune, sometimes they'll head parallel on the beach, they may head toward a condo that's particularly bright. But the problem with this is that hatchlings have a very limited amount of energy stored up when they emerge from their nests to make it off the beach and then out offshore until they can reach the floating lines of sargassum seaweed. That's when they will feed again. They're not going to feed in that time in between. And so the more time they spend wandering around on the beach, the more energy they're going to use up and the less energy that they're going to have to be able to get themselves out offshore. So that means that they end up dehydrated, desiccated. They become easy prey for all sorts of things that are wandering around on the beach. Unfortunately, sometimes they also end up in roads, and so a lot of these disorientation events end up being fatal. So one of the ways that we sort of monitor where lighting problems are occurring is through disorientation reports. And these are reports that our sea turtle permit holders that do nesting surveys will submit to us every time they come across an incidence of disorientation. And these sort of help us to understand in an indirect way where lighting problems are occurring and the extent of those lighting problems. And it's important to understand that these don't necessarily point out where bad lights are. These are being completed in the morning when folks are doing their morning nesting surveys, but we do ask them to send these reports to code enforcement. And that's one of the ways that we engage with code enforcement in areas where there are lighting ordinances to help them sort of figure out where they might need to be focusing their enforcement efforts or looking for violations. So this is sort of a look at what our disorientation numbers have looked like in the recent past. Unfortunately, I don't have 2016 numbers completed yet, but prior to that, you can see we do have a little bit of an increase in the reports that we've received. So the top line there is the number of reports that we've received for incidents of hatchling disorientation, and the line on the bottom is incidents of nesting female disorientation. So when it comes to hatchlings, we definitely are seeing a little bit of a recent increase, but as you can see by the bars behind it, those are our nest numbers over that same time period. So we're having an increase in nesting as well over these last several years, and so part of that increase in disorientations is likely a result of there just being more nests on the beach, which obviously is a good thing, but ultimately our goal would be to bring that ratio down. So over the last few decades, there's been a lot of research into lighting and sea turtles and the impact and the interaction. And we've been able to sort of figure out what the biggest problems are. And unfortunately, the things that tend to be problematic are the things that everyone wants to have. They're the most commonly used lights. They're the things that people like to put on their houses or their condos to make them more attractive. So a lot of the most commonly used lights are a problem. Any type of white lighting, because remember, white light is a full spectrum light, so it has those short wavelengths that are really attractive to turtles. So anything with white lights, anything that's really tall and bright and unshielded, anything that's very colorful, that's not amber or red. So like I said, most of the things that people want to put up tend to be problematic. So in doing all that research, we've been able to identify not only the lights that are a problem, but also the lights that are less of an impact. And so we've taken all of that research and sort of compacted it into our 3 golden rules. And this has become our beachfront lighting motto. It's what we use to try and get the message out and help people understand how to tell if their lights are good lights. So our 3 golden rules are: keep it low, keep it shielded, and keep it long wavelength. So keep it low, keep it shielded, keep it long. This is our mantra that we use when we're trying to educate people about good beachfront lighting. So what does this all mean? Well, keep it low sort of refers to 2 different components of lighting. We're talking about the mounting heights, and we're also talking about the amount of light. So keeping lights mounted as low as possible helps to prevent extra light from spreading out into places where it's not needed. And keeping the brightness down to a minimum helps prevent overlighting of an area. So if you think about what your task is, if you're putting a night light in your bathroom, you wouldn't put a 100-watt floodlight. So that's sort of the mentality that we encourage when people are choosing the wattage of lights to put on their homes. So keep it shielded just means to keep the actual glowing part of the light shielded from view. So it may be a bulb or a filament or a diode or a flame if it's some sort of gas lantern. The point is to keep that part shielded. 1, because it's the brightest part of the fixture, and anything that's very bright can be problematic, so we want to shield the brightest part of the fixture. But also keeping that part shielded helps direct the light to places where it's going to be useful. And finally, keep it long refers to the color of the bulbs. So remember, turtles are very attracted to short wavelengths of light, but they're less impacted by long wavelengths of light. So we recommend using light sources that emit light above 560 nanometers. So that's your ambers, your oranges, and your reds. And fortunately now, with the increase in LED technology, these types of bulbs are widely available and they're really inexpensive. These used to be, $30 or $40 a bulb when this technology was first becoming available. And now you can get these often at hardware stores for about $5. So the good news is we have lots of ways that we can approach this problem. So lighting is a really multifaceted issue, right? It's ingrained in a lot of areas of our lives, and it's necessary for a lot of purposes. And so we have to manage the issue in a lot of different ways to try and get at all of those facets. So obviously, because of the Endangered Species Act, we have a little bit of a legal nexus to work on some of these issues. There's federal regulations as well as state and local regulations. We've worked with our federal partners at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop the Wildlife Lighting Certification Program, which helps to provide a resource for people that are looking for fixtures and bulbs that are appropriate for beachfront lighting. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we also are really excited about lots of technological advances that are coming along in the last several years with regard to LED technology. And through our Wildlife Lighting Certification Program, it gives us an opportunity to work with lighting manufacturers to help move those advances in a direction that are going to be beneficial for coastal areas. We obviously do a lot of education and outreach, right? Because the more people know about this, the more they're going to be able to spread the message to their family, their friends, their neighbors about making sure that they're using appropriate lighting practices. And we do a lot of work both through state permits, doing lighting reviews, but also reaching out and providing technical assistance to properties that are trying to retrofit their lights and make themselves a little bit more lighting friendly. So there are a lot of ways to go at this problem. Some of them are through legal means, and some of them are just reaching out to people and getting them excited about the issue and helping them to want to do these things voluntarily. The big message here, though, is that it takes partnerships. Because this is such a diverse issue, there's no way that FWC or, the federal government or a local government, there's no way that any one organization could handle this on their own. And so our goal has been to develop a very wide and very diverse network of partnerships. And all of these players are involved in lighting in different ways, and they're able to reach people in different ways and go at this problem in different ways. So these partners include the federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries. It involves our partner state agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Transportation. It involves local governments, the county and municipal governments. We work a lot with utility companies like FPL or Gulf Power. We work a lot with lighting manufacturers. We have a lot of partners that are lighting manufacturers that work with us to produce fixtures that are appropriate for beachfront lighting and that will meet the needs of people that live on the beach. We do a lot of work with code enforcement and the Association of Code Enforcement. And we definitely could not do any of it without the work of our many, many, many sea turtle permit holders that help collect all of the disorientation data. So they do a lot of work with regard to lighting. So if we want to look at the regulatory aspects of lighting, because sea turtles are a federally listed species, this all sort of stems under the umbrella of the Endangered Species Act. And the Act does several important things, but with respect specifically to turtles and to lighting, there are a few main points about the Endangered Species Act. The most important, obviously, is that it provides an opportunity for species to be listed, either as threatened or as endangered. All 5 species of sea turtles in Florida are federally listed, so they all fall under the protections of the Endangered Species Act. And so with that, you are not allowed to kill, harm, harass, transport, sell, or generally look cross-eyed at a sea turtle. All of those things are against the rules under the ESA. But the ESA allows us the opportunity to manage sea turtles in our state through a Section 6 agreement. Like many federal agencies and state agencies, we have not enough staff to cover all of the many responsibilities that need to be covered in order to properly manage sea turtles. So because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is spread so thin, as we all are, we are allowed to enter into a Section 6 agreement with the federal agencies so that we can take over the management of sea turtles in our state. So that's where the Florida laws come in. And there are a couple of them that pertain to turtles, sort of with respect to lighting. The Marine Turtle Protection Act is basically, in part, the state version of the Endangered Species Act. It mimics that language about not being able to harm, harass, kill, take, possess, sell any sea turtle parts, nests, eggs, and so on. But it provides us the opportunity to permit people that are qualified to be able to do some of those things. in order to manage the species. So if we need to count nests and know how many nests there are so that we can understand what the population looks like, then we have to have people that are able to mark nests off. And so you have to have a permit to be able to do that. So the Marine Turtle Protection Act allows FWC to issue those permits. It also provides an opportunity for the Department of Environmental Protection to include special conditions in their permits for projects that might impact nesting areas to help mitigate impacts to sea turtles. And so when DEP receives these projects for review, we're able to provide them comments that they can include in those permits to mitigate any effects to sea turtles. We also have our model lighting ordinance, which anyone who's familiar with sea turtle lighting in Florida probably is familiar with. One of the important things about it is that it designates all sandy beaches in Florida, except for that Big Bend area, as nesting habitat. So it doesn't matter if there's been a nest in the last year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. This rule says that any sandy beach in Florida, excluding those counties in the Big Bend, counts as nesting beach, which is really important when it comes to considering projects that might impact the nesting beach. It also provides guidance for local governments on how to implement and design their own lighting ordinances. And it really puts an emphasis on the partnership between the state and the local governments on managing lighting on their beaches jointly. And it encourages those local governments to adopt a lighting ordinance to sort of uphold their end of the bargain in that partnership. It's important to note, though, that the model lighting ordinance is only a model. It's not actually a law. So an FWC officer can't, come knocking on your door and say that you're in violation of this ordinance. But the point of this ordinance is really to encourage and foster that partnership between the state and the local governments. So that's where all of our municipal and county partners come in. And at this point, most coastal areas of Florida have their own lighting ordinances. So if you take a look at this map, those counties in blue are the only remaining counties that do not have a sea turtle lighting ordinance. However, most of those counties have multiple municipalities within them that have a lighting ordinance. So there are very few areas of coastal Florida at this point that are not covered by either a municipal or a county lighting ordinance. And this is really important for us because, as I said, that model lighting ordinance is not something that we can just go out and cite people for. So we rely very heavily on our local partners to enforce their local lighting ordinances. And in doing so, we do a lot of training, we have a lot of coordination and a lot of communication, particularly between myself and my partners at FWC with our local code enforcement. So one of the big issues that people always bring up when it comes to lighting is safety and security. So they want to know, if our lighting is turtle friendly, are we going to be safe? And the good news is, yes, you will. As long as it's done properly and your lighting is installed to meet all the other codes, then yes, you will be perfectly safe. FWC did many years ago a review of crime statistics in Florida. We reached out to those areas that had lighting ordinances to find out if there were any differences in their rates of crime prior to implementing their lighting ordinances versus after implementation of those lighting ordinances. And we found that there really was no difference. So sea turtle friendly lighting doesn't have to mean that you're gonna get mugged in a parking lot. And we work very hard to make sure that lighting standards are met using these turtle-friendly lighting practices. We've also found and read lots of information, not only from our state, but from other areas where these lower levels of lighting can be really beneficial for drivers because it makes it a lot easier to see and it reduces the incidence, particularly of traffic accidents involving a vehicle and a pedestrian. As I said, there are lots of codes that require certain amounts of lighting. And so that's something that we have to work with on a daily basis, is making sure these properties that we are giving guidance to and giving recommendations to are still meeting their other lighting requirements. So we have to make sure that, yes, they're still meeting the Florida Building Code, and yes, they're still meeting the Fire Prevention Code, and that if the fire marshal comes out, they're not going to get cited for not having enough lighting. So one of the opportunities that has presented itself to us more recently is getting involved with learning about CPTED. If you're not familiar with CPTED, it's crime prevention through environmental design, and it's essentially a set of design elements for communities and built environments that naturally help deter crime. So these are elements that a lot of police departments are implementing and they use on a very regular basis to help naturally deter crime in their areas. And what we found in sort of looking through the elements of CPTED is that a lot of the things that they recommend line up very well with our recommendations for beachfront lighting. Things like using luminaries that are well shielded and preventing glare and having a lower level of even light as opposed to very bright patches of light. These are all things that are sort of cross recommendations. And so learning about CPTED has provided us an opportunity to start working a lot more with local police departments to make sure that when we're working on new community projects, that we can implement these elements as well as elements of turtle-friendly lighting into those projects. So obviously all of this takes a lot of coordination between all of these partnerships. And so we do that in a lot of ways. One of those is lighting workshops. We do lighting workshops for the public. We do them for our permit holders. We do them for code enforcement to provide training. We do them for local governments. Anyone who asks us to come and talk to them about turtle lighting, we will gladly come and do it because this helps to get everyone on the same page. We do a lot of work with those local governments when it comes to planning new large-scale projects. So there are several areas that we're working with right now that are undergoing large-scale sort of redevelopment projects. This area in particular is down in South Florida. They're redoing the whole area around their pier and they're redoing their pier. So rather than saying, oh, we're gonna build a parking garage, can you help us? And now we're gonna build a restaurant, can you help us? They said, this is our master plan for this area. How can we make this whole area meet your recommendations? So working with local governments on these large-scale projects helps the city to become a model for their residents once those projects are completed. We do a lot of work with local governments also involving their lighting ordinances. We're able to provide comments and recommendations and language that we've seen work well in other areas. It's one of the benefits of being able to work with code enforcement statewide is that we get to talk to them about what works and what doesn't. And so we can help pass that information along when it comes time for places to either implement a new ordinance or to update their ordinance. We are fortunate enough that we're able to do a lot of research. Sometimes it's more targeted research, sometimes it's a little more broad scale. We also get to bring in a lot of our partners on some of these projects. This one in particular was with Florida Power and Light. We were testing a streetlight prototype for use near nesting beaches. So we get really excited when we have an opportunity to work on these issues that are widespread and that can involve a lot of our other partners. And as I mentioned, we manage the Wildlife Lighting Certification Program. And the basis of this program is that manufacturers submit their products to us. We test them, make sure that those products meet the keep it low, keep it shielded, keep it long guidelines. And if they do, then we provide them a certification letter. And we provide that as an option when folks are looking for something to put in that's appropriate. And not only does this give us the opportunity to work with, to provide a resource to the public, but it gives us the opportunity to work with those manufacturers directly so that we can help them understand what it is that is going to be beneficial for use near the beach so they can tailor their products to make sure that they're meeting those specifications. So at this point, we've received so many fixtures and so many bulbs over the years that we now have lots of options in pretty much every category you could ever want. So anytime anyone wants to retrofit, or even if they're building a new project, this is a resource that we can provide to them to look for fixtures that are going to be appropriate. So our ultimate goal is not only to have good lighting for turtles, but we need good lighting for people. As I said, there are lots of codes that have to be met legally, but we also want people to enjoy being in these spaces. And if you think about a lot of these properties that are, in tourist areas, people are paying lots and lots of money to come hang out at these properties, to stay at these hotels. We want them to be enjoying themselves as well. And so our goal is to make sure that we're creating an environment that works for everyone. And I think in a lot of cases, we've been very successful in doing that. This is an example that I like to use a lot. It's a hotel down in Miami Beach. They have a completely turtle-friendly lighting plan, and it is a huge hotel. They have 2 pool decks, a couple of spas, they have an outdoor bar, they have an outdoor restaurant, they've got courtyards and reflecting ponds. And if you go out to the beach and you look back at the property, this is what you see, this bottom photo. It's not bright, it's not shining out to the beach, it's not causing disruption. So we really feel like when we all sort of work together on our pieces and parts, we really can achieve a good product. So again, thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited that I had an opportunity to be here, and I'd be happy to take questions. Mm-hmm. Yes, we absolutely run into that. Our biggest issue, a lot of times with condos, have a lot of elderly residents, and so often there is a fear that there's not going to be enough light, and then it's going to become a hazard for their residents, that they will trip, that they'll fall. So that definitely becomes an issue. And sometimes in cases we have to get creative and find ways where we can provide a little extra light. And I think that we've been able to do it in a lot of cases. Sometimes it's, it just takes thinking outside the box. Certainly with regard to design, I would say that's where we have much more pushback than we do with the safety, particularly with, new construction. We often are provided plans to review for a project once an architect or a lighting designer has already created their vision. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of times it's very hard sometimes to have those conversations with them and say, we understand your vision, but we have to tone it down a little bit. So we do absolutely have those conflicts sometimes, but I think we typically are able to come to some sort of happy medium.
Is that working? The light has to be green. A bad color. Red light before. That was a good color. My question is, I couldn't help but notice on the map that Pinellas County does not have a county-wide ordinance, yet most of the municipalities do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you know Pinellas County, or whether you have statistics for generally in Florida. How often do you have to resort to actually enforcement? That is, citing, condos, hotels. I'm thinking mostly of commercial entities rather than private entities for failure to follow local, municipal, or county ordinances.
Sure, that's a good question. So we personally cannot cite them because it's a local, it's a local ordinance. And honestly, I would say it varies dramatically from place to place, partly because of just overall levels of compliance, but there's a lot of variation in the way that code enforcement departments handle the enforcement of their lighting ordinances, whether it's a more educational approach, whether it's a we see it and we cite you right away approach. So it's hard to answer that question because it's so varied around the state.
What about Pinellas County or the municipalities here? Are they good? Do we know? I mean, I know we don't have as many sea turtles.
I mean, again, even within the county, it varies from city to city. So some cities, I can't think of numbers off the top of my head, but some cities definitely have higher rates of disorientation than others. The good thing about Pinellas County is even though there is no county ordinance, as far as I'm aware, the entire coastline is still covered with municipal ordinances.
It's nice. All right, we have a question back here. Mr. George Hiller, do you have a question? Oh, Jenna had one behind the post.
So obviously the nesting has gone up, which we're super excited about. What has been increasing the nesting? Is it just the ordinances, or have the turtles been doing something different recently for the increase to be happening?
That's a good question, and the short answer is we don't really know. Unfortunately, it's hard to point to a single cause. We've definitely seen long-term increases in nesting, particularly with green turtles. We've seen very drastic increases over the last particularly the last decade. Loggerheads, even though this 10-year period that we saw is an increase, loggerheads have done this sort of up and down roller coaster thing for a while, so we're not really sure long-term what that means. But we really think that the increases that we're seeing now are a result of all the protections that were put in place as a result of the Endangered Species Act. So turtles are very long-lived. It can take them 20 to 25 years to reach sexual maturity. So it takes a long time for those conservation techniques to have any sort of payoff. And so we really think that it's a combination of all the things that have been done over the last several decades that are contributing to that.
Are there any subsidies or fee waivers that encourage homeowners who maybe have homes that are outside of code because of age to bring their homes up to code in order to protect these sea turtles?
That's a good question, and I don't really know. Unfortunately, what I can say is there's not usually a whole lot of money out there to help people retrofit. We have recently, and as the Sea Turtle Conservancy also has recently had little bits of money for very targeted areas from grants that we've received to help with some of that. But by and large, it tends to be, at the homeowner's expense to have to do that, which is unfortunate. I wish that I could say that, yes, there were, you could get tax write-offs or you could get, you could get reimbursed. Typically, that's not the case. It's more just you have to do it because the ordinance says you have to do it. Sure.
Any other questions? Okay, I get to ask the last question, which is what we always like to ask, is what can we all do? If you could name one or two things that we could do as students, citizens of Florida, professors, faculty, staff, whatever, how can we help the problem with lighting and sea turtles?
That's an excellent question. I would say the number one thing that you can do is to follow these guidelines. It doesn't matter if you live near the beach or not, because sky glow is also a significant problem when it comes to particularly hatchling disorientation. And we know that that's true because we see hatchling disorientation in places where there are no lights. So even in places like, let's say, Canaveral National Seashore, even though it doesn't happen frequently, we do see occasional instances where there are hatchlings that disorient. And because disorientation is inherently a lighting problem, we know that it's because of sky glow. So people often feel like, even though they don't live near the beach, or because they don't live near the beach, that they can sort of tune this out and it doesn't really apply to me because I don't have a beachfront condo. And the truth is, everyone can implement these strategies wherever you live, because not only is sky glow an issue for turtles on the beach, but artificial lighting is a problem for all sorts of wildlife. And so you're going to be helping other wildlife as well as sea turtles.
Thank you. Let's give Tonya one last round of applause.
Thank you.